Hello and welcome to Who Needs Western Civ, a podcast of liberal arts and classical education. I'm your host, Clay Green, a postdoctoral fellow here at the Hamilton Center for Classical and Civic Education at the University of Florida. And now that that mouthful's over, I'm going to introduce my guest for today, Colin Hoch. Colin is a PhD candidate in History and Renaissance Studies at Yale University. He previously received an MA from Yale in European and Russian Studies and an MA in Social Sciences from the University of Chicago. Colin is writing a dissertation on the medieval and Renaissance Bible, which I've had a chance to read, and it's in great condition, and it's getting better all the time. Colin is one of my best friends in the whole world. And besides that, he's an incredibly impressive scholar. So I'm very grateful to have him here. His dissertation is a multilingual dissertation working on many, many different languages, many translations of the Bible. I know that you know Latin, German, you know French.
That's right. Yes.
What am I missing? Are those all of them?
Those are the main, right? So, but within those, you've got the dialects. But I'm not going to pretend that those are as the basics. But
I know that your one of your chapters is about an Alsatian dialect Bible.
That's right. Yeah, and it was a lot to learn. I mean, even Germans who I was talking to said, this is extremely antiquated, and they were like, "Good luck," and they patted me on it. But no, I'm not going to toot my own horn too much. I mean, it took a lot of work to run through. But yeah, your flattery will get you everywhere.
Well, I'll toot your horn, Colin.
Thanks,
yeah, that's why I'm here. So thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, for Clay, and for organizing this. I think it's a great idea to interview people, to bring people together on this subject, which is a vital subject that's it needs defense right now in academia, and so much has not been said recently that needs to be rearticulated in defense of Western civilization. It's become incumbent upon those who know, like you and I, and people who have a history in this tradition, who appreciate this tradition. It's a tradition that suffuses our life and gives us meaning. And I think there's a kind of contempt that comes from familiarity in academia now, where we have to kind of push back on that and justify ourselves. And so this is a wonderful opportunity to do so, and I appreciate that.
Well, I appreciate you being here. Hosting this podcast had made me realize that I know absolutely nothing about Western civilization. So maybe you'll teach me some actual facts. That's what historians are for, right?
That's great.
So, Colin, I mentioned a little bit about your background, and I know you to have a really kind of diverse and broad interest in not only European history, but also Ottoman history, various other histories of the world. But let's focus on European history. What is it that first drew your attention to European history? Was there a specific period, a specific event, maybe a teacher? What drew you to the subject?
Well, originally, the interest was spurred through my English father. My dad moved to America in the 70s as a teenager, had a history of going back and forth. And growing up, I would hear stories I would hear Henry V and Falstaff, and I would be told about Churchill. There was always a sense in my home that we had a deeper history that was not connected to this place, i.e. Texas. Now, my dad fell in love with the romance of the West too. He was one of those Europeans who really fell in love with the American mythos of the West. But at the same time, I still was imbued with this idea that we had a deeper past, and that deeper past lay in Europe. And there was a kind of familial aspect of that too. There was a heritage aspect of it too. But it was also a universal thing too. It wasn't necessarily like this is only our past. My dad really imbued this idea in me that this is a useful past for all of us. He first got me into Shakespeare, and he first got me into the diffusion of the Bible. He was religious as well. He is religious. And so my mother and I also did the same thing. We were both became interested in history through my father. In terms of teaching, in terms of periods too, I kind of worked my way back into the Middle Ages and the Renaissance and the early modern era, the Reformation era, because I originally was very interested in the German Romantics. I love their poetry. I like Novalis, Friedrich von Hardenberg.
Yeah, that's one of many areas of considerable overlap. As you know, right now I'm teaching Goethe, and yeah, Novalis is bedtime reading. Not all
Oh,
of it, but
a
some of
genius.
it is quite
And
beautiful poetry.
an affective genius. I mean, along with Goethe. But I became fascinated by how fascinated they were by the Middle Ages in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars, and in the wake of this vast cultural trauma that occurred in Germany, in France, in Italy, with the Napoleonic armies coming through with these basically Enlightenment ideals enforced with the bayonet, right? And so Germans really had to reconcile what makes us different, what makes us unique. And a lot of it has to do with the stones around us and the story of those stones around us. So you have things like the rebuilding of Cologne Cathedral, which had basically been kind of abandoned through the Enlightenment era. It had become passé to be associated with the Middle Ages. And the Romantics really thought about what made them unique as a people. Fichte, it expresses through the language and the literature, but there's a lot of medievalism in there too that gets expressed through preservation. And so I became more interested in what they wanted to preserve. And this is, I think it was I was in college, late college during this. I took a lot of courses in Western Civ in college. And my favorites were one on the German Romantics, another one with a man named John Damas at Stephen F. Austin in the Renaissance and the Reformation. Back then it was called Ren Ref, right? Nowadays, as you well know, we have to kind of lump it all into early modern to speak about it. And that's another can of worms, right? But that's the origin. That's the origin of why
Call it the very late Middle Ages. How about that? There's a philosopher named John Marenbon who I know you read, because I read this thing I'm about to reference in a class I took with you. Boethius was with Ian Cornelius. John Marenbon refers to medieval philosophy as beginning with Aristotle and ending with Leibniz.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot more appreciation now, I think, of how medieval modernity is. I mean, you think of like Quintus Curtius being a big part of that, but also there's a lot of kind of postmodern thinkers.
Quintus Curtius, can you help us out here?
Oh, Quintus Curtius, you got to forgive me, but it's been a while since I've read it. But he really talks about how Latin literature in the Middle Ages.
Oh, that text. Okay.
Yeah,
I thought his first name was Ernst.
Was it Ernst?
Ernst Curtius?
Ernst
European
Curtius?
Literature in the Latin Middle Ages?
Yeah, you're right. I'm sorry, I misremembered.
This isn't a comprehensive exam, Colin.
No,
I've long since passed those.
Yeah. But what I know more about traditionally is there's a lot of kind of existentialist thinkers who have gone back to the German mystics, the Rhineland mystics, people like Meister Eckhart, Johannes Tauler, Heinrich Zeusse, and seen a lot of the germinal ideas of existentialism. Now it's articulated then obviously in Christian metaphysics, right? In Aristotle too, but not as much as Aquinas. But still, I mean, I think there's a lot of medieval in our thought that we're just now kind of really appreciating.
That's a great point. And I sort of interrupted the flow of your story with my irrelevant comment. But we're getting to the heart of something I happen to know about your intellectual development and interests. You are a scholar of the early modern period, as we say, but you're one who is interested in medieval holdovers, and you're interested in, obviously, as you just said, in medievalisms in the 19th century, maybe even meaningful revivals of medieval things in the 20th century, rediscovery of great medieval mystic philosophers like Meister Eckhart.
Absolutely.
So medievalism seems like it's a part of what interests you, and let's locate that a little bit in the early modern period and talk about what is the significance for us evaluating the early modern period for thinking about medieval holdovers.
I think let's talk about the term early modern first. I think that's a good way to get into it. So recently, as you well know, Clay, in the Academy, people have really tried to emphasize what they see as modern in the 15th and 16th and 17th centuries. And those things have a long history, going back to the kind of foundational figures in the history of the Renaissance who are interested in the kind of the birth of the man, the birth of the human, right? The humanities. They people like Hans Baron, for example, who are interested in kind of
we had to read Jakob Burckhardt together. So
exactly right. Jakob Burckhardt. Absolutely. I mean, that narrative of early modernity.
Burckhardt, if folks don't know, is a 19th century Swiss historian. Let's call him a historian. He's more than a historian. Some might say less, but I think more is the more appropriate way.
Yes.
Who theorized the Renaissance. And could you just say something about what that theorization was?
Of course. So Burckhardt was really kind of reading back what he saw as the birth of individualism. First, the Italian city-states.
Very modern, very characteristic of the modern.
Absolutely. So he talks about the kind of the birth of atheism. He sees in the ability of the Italian city-states to, say, for example, go to war with the papacy, which is something that we think of as very bizarre as a modern person. But he talks about how that would have been inconceivable before. This kind of birth of a new kind of political man, a new kind of political autonomous thinker. And he locates that in the politics, but he also talks about how, the politics obviously is downstream of culture. That's another useful phrase, but the culture had changed such that the humanities were being much more emphasized in education and in the graphic arts. So with Burckhardt, you kind of see a birth, or Burckhardt's Renaissance, right, is a kind of rebirth of the classical spirit, which for him is an autonomous spirit. It's a spirit that rejects tradition and rejects form. And I think now we know much more about the 15th and the 16th centuries that places, to your question originally, that places the mentalities more in the Middle Ages. As you said, the very late Middle Ages. There's been considerable debate, especially around, for example, if you want to crystallize it into a person. 2017 was the anniversary of Martin Luther, right? The nailing of the 95 Theses. And one of the great debates was, for centuries, Luther has been held as a hero of modernity. This idea of taking
including by some of your German romantics that you were mentioning.
Absolutely. I mean, he kind of crystallizes for them the spirit of the German soul, to use the kind of romantic one, as someone who can kind of break free as a kind of heroic thinker. He's not a universal thinker, right? He's deeply German, and Germans recognize this. And so when it
nationalism also being a fork of this modernity that we're talking about, nationalism didn't exist in the same way. At least we're laying out the traditional story here. It didn't exist in the same way in the Middle Ages.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so when it came time to commemorate Luther, there had been so much literature and so much scholarship that came out since this kind of lionization of Luther as an intellectual, or not intellectual, but an enlightenment or enlightened thinker or a national thinker, that as a modern figure. And specifically, there was the work of a man named Heiko Obermann, who was a foundational Reformation scholar. He was a Dutch scholar who moved to Arizona and really kind of pioneered a lot of Reformation studies in America in the 20th century. But Heiko really popularized this idea of Luther as the medieval man, as the kind of full expression of the Middle Ages rather than the modern. I mean, Luther is deeply concerned with late medieval traditions like the art of dying well, for example. Late medieval traditions like engagement with the demonic, right, which is a late medieval phenomenon too. Luther's deeply engaged with questions of confession, right, which was a major issue in the late Middle Ages with respect to what's called the Facere doctrine, right? Luther, a lot of his ideas have to be centered in late Middle Ages, and he would never, for example, had any truck with the idea that he believed in sort of freedom of thought or freedom of belief. For Luther, there was a right way, which was his way, and there was a wrong way, which was every other way, right? The man didn't even get along with other reformers who basically saw him as their father, their spiritual father. Calvin, young Calvin, who obviously is a brilliant theologian, one of my favorite theologians of all time, and yours as well. Just an incredible writer, an incredible talent. Often tried to write to Luther when he was a young man, and Luther would not even read his letters. In fact, his secretary, who was Philip Melanchthon, often had to correspond for Luther because Luther refused to read Calvin's letters. And so that's not a very sort of modern ecumenical of belief, freedom of thought figure, is it? No, it's not. So that's kind of what we've been wrestling with respect to how modern is early modernity, how modern is the Renaissance, right? That's what we've been dealing with in the field. And I think it's trending to where there's a balanced view of these people, of people like Luther and Calvin. But we're also having to deal beyond the internal battles of the field with having to justify, why should we care about Luther and Calvin now, right? Why should we care about Teresa of Avila or Francis? And the answer seems obvious, like people like you and I who are kind of soaked in this tradition and see it. But I think as more and more people kind of lose the plot and more people we're encouraged to kind of live in the moment these days. We're encouraged that newer is always better. And so we don't necessarily see the value of learning, even though if you look at them, bringing us back to St. Francis in the garden, it's all around us. The remnants are all around us if you just look.
We were just talking off air about the phenomenon of gardens having a little statuary of St. Francis who's got a little bird bath, and the birds are drinking some water or bathing, doing whatever birds do. Hopefully not. Well, anyway, this is a little reminder of medieval Christendom that most people don't think about as being any kind of cultural legacy. It's just a little quiche item. But Colin was just explaining how it could be a kind of educational topos that could lead people further into a knowledge of their cultural heritage and background.
Absolutely. And people kind of fail to see, because they don't know the depth of the cultural background, how much of a rebel Francis was. I mean, Francis was a countercultural figure when he came out. It was not the common thing to do for a merchant's son to let go of everything that was coming to him and live as Christ did, to live as a hermit, to go into the towns. I mean, that was a mendicant revolution, to go into the towns, the urban centers that are reviving in high medieval Europe, and to preach in the street, to preach poverty, to preach humility, to revolutionize what it meant to be a lay Christian. The Franciscans kind of narrow the gap between what it means to be a good ethical Christian, between lay and cleric, because they're somewhere in between as a mendicant, right? They're not a monastic, nor are they fully lay. But to your point, Clay, I think that has become so kitschified. I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing overall, as long as it endures. As long as it endures, I think that kitsch can have a value. I think people are enticed by kitsch, right? It doesn't necessarily turn people off completely to the depth of the history behind it, because it kind of piques their interest, right? I think it would be more disadvantageous to forget these things and pull them away and kind of try to focus on the present. But the present, I think, has no meaning without the past, right? It's I think we need to keep these things, these tokens of the past in our cultural sphere, in our memory sphere. Yeah.
And that's really the subject of your work, isn't it? I mean, you take as one of your central jumping off points the idea of cultural memory,
right.
How a given society contains or preserves echoes of the past, but also reconfigures those into their own image. So particularly, you're interested in the medieval and early modern Bible.
Right.
Can you say a little bit about how the Bible has either provided Europeans a sense of the past, or how Europeans have used the Bible to relate to the past?
Sure. So I think the Bible is the most universal and protean document of the entire period. It's the means through which people think about the past and themselves in relation to the past, which is something that, if you would take a purely social or scientific point of view, it's what Hoch is talking about with terms of cultural memory. It has to do with how people reconfigure, as you said, reconfigure their past using the kind of symbols and signs that are passed down to each other, to different generations. And each generation takes what's ostensibly the universal story of humanity and makes it their own, and says,
meaning the Bible is the universal
exactly.
story of humanity.
Yeah, yes. Absolutely. Yeah. What initially, if you look at the Pentateuch, right, is the story of the Jews, right? It's the story of the creation of man, but also the story of these kingdoms, Israel, Judah, their struggles against the peoples around them, their struggles with God, Israel, their struggles with their own failings, right? They constantly fail in the Old Testament. They're constantly having to reestablish their relationship to God in new ways. And so I think, that originally is a very Jewish text, but becomes a universalized text throughout the Middle Ages, such that, one of my chapters, I talk specifically about the book of Esther. And what this Alsatian workshop does with the book of Esther is it turns Esther into a figure of the German middle class. She becomes a burgher's daughter, right? It's tailored towards a kind of aspirational late medieval German burgher culture, where it's courtly, right? But it's not necessarily high nobility courtly. It's definitely tailored to their place in time. I recently, a more early modern example, I'm doing a paper right now. I'm giving a talk soon at the 16th Century Society and Conference in Baltimore. And the paper is all about how Huldrych Zwingli, who was, of course, the reformer of Zurich in the 1520s, really looked to the history or the memory of Israel, but a very selective memory of Israel, to define what his version of Christianity was going to be. He looks at, what is the Abrahamic covenant, right? How does the Abrahamic covenant apply whenever we strip the churches of, say, images and sacraments, and we focus purely on the Bible, or his version of the Bible, right? It becomes a faith-based covenant. But it's a memory of Israel that is kind of selectively forgetting the Levites, right? Forgetting the sacrifices of the temple, forgetting deliberately forgetting some things that don't match what he views as the proper things to take from Israel. And in doing so, he's also kind of selectively forgetting rabbinic Judaism, and he's repudiating rabbinic Judaism. So, as you said, there's a kind of sifting process that has to occur with cultural memory. It's constantly labile. It has to be kind of crystallized into things. If you read kind of memory studies, they're famously kind of diffuse, right? They often have to be crystallized into particular works of art, or particular expressions and literary forms or artistic forms. We can study how those change throughout time, and they're constantly changing. But you can never really formulate a really robust theory of memory, because it's so expansive. But it's still nonetheless useful, because it tells you what's happening in human terms. It's not. It tells you what's happening in our mind whenever we engage with the Bible, and because as you translate the Bible, you're wrestling with your own time. You have to kind of wrestle with your own time and how to make it amenable, but also you're wrestling with a vision of the past that is constantly changing. Yeah.
That's great. That's incredibly helpful. What would we say is the role of this kind of cultural memory in constituting something we would call Western Civ? That's not a term we've used too much here yet. So what do you think is the role for Western Civ?
I think Western Civ, I think it's a fantastic question. I think Western Civ is a community of memories. It's a community built by memory, collective memory, cultural memory, and individual memories. we talk about the material cultures of Western Civ. That includes keep going back to the Francis statue, but that's a part of it. But that Francis statue has meaning only with respect to our memories that are associated with it, and they have to be collective. So Western Civ really is built on an empire of memory. Yeah, I think when it comes to defending Western Civ, we really have to have a mind towards how the memory has to be continually shifted to talk to new people. We can't necessarily use the same terms or use the same questions that we did before, especially as we in the West become more secular, and there are hundreds of thousands of new people every year who come into Western civilization who don't necessarily have the same foundational background. They have a kind of, they'll sometimes get some civic educations like that, but they don't know the deep history, right? And so we have to ask new questions, but we can bring them into our memory. We can. It's not impossible. And they're going to take something different from it, but we can still teach a kind of an appreciation of our memories, our cultural memories. If we allow them to be changed in a way that the essence remains the same, right? Which is difficult to do, but is doable, I think.
I'll offer a kind of example of this because I think that could be helpful. So in the last few years, there's been this semi-controversy about the New York Times project or initiative called the 1619 Project. And the essence of that is arguing for the most important date in the history of the founding of America being 1619, which is the time that the first African slave was brought into North America. You'll forgive me, I don't have all the details of this always at my beck and call, but this is the essence of it. And that this is the appropriate beginning for talking about America instead of 1776. And I have a bit of an oddball perspective on this. Obviously, I think the true beginning of America is 1776. And part of the reason why I believe that is because I think that the universal principles of the Declaration of Independence really marked a profound break in the history of civilization. That said, however, I can understand thinking a little bit differently how a person could come to the conclusion that 1619 is a more appropriate beginning. And here's why. If the protagonists of the historical story, if the people looking back at the past and thinking about where was the turning point in their history, the most important turning point in the history of the mostly Anglo-Americans, English descendant Americans, was the time when they ceased to be, for the first time in how many thousands of years, we don't know, subjects of the English crown. That was a profound change for them. Arguably less profound even for the non-English immigrants, right? The moment at which they were no longer English, they were something else called American, incredibly important for them. That said, the moment that would be most important if the protagonists instead were Black Americans would have to be the moment that they were brought in slavery to this new continent. I understand why that would be considered the break. And there are other problems with the 1619 Project's history. There are problems, from my perspective, with the vision of America that it presents. But that particular piece of it, of who is the protagonist of the history that we inherit, that piece of it makes a certain amount of sense, because the most profound change is different depending on who is doing the narration of their own history. So with that in mind, as a stark example, how could we think about the history of The Renaissance or the Middle Ages, which traditionally means the history of the Renaissance in Europe, doesn't always
Sure.
mean that, but traditionally, how do
Yeah.
we think about that in a global context, or in a context that imagines different historical protagonists and different people looking back and identifying with history? Because I get the strong sense from you that you do want people to identify with history.
Yeah.
Hopefully, they don't simply identify with a kind of racial history. I think that's negative no matter what your racial background. But how do we do that?
It's
Provincialize Europe? Maybe we shouldn't
yeah.
put it that way, but
Yeah.
how do we think about this multi-pronged history?
I would say this is that we want people to be fascinated and to be interested in, say, the Medici. We want people to see them, to be able to see themselves in the history of the West, of the Middle Ages, of the Renaissance, of the Reformation.
Mm.
We want to be able to meet people where they are culturally and teach them how that stuff is still extremely useful in structuring their lives. I mean, they live in Western civil, they live in the wake of these things, right? So it's impossible to escape unless you're trying to deliberately kind of shut your eyes and ears to it. I think if you look for it, you'll find it, right? But at the same time, there's a kind of danger in forgetting kind of the roots of it as well, which how to articulate this? We don't want to strip people of their cultural heritage to the point where it's no longer theirs and they can no longer claim any right to it. I would say it's a tricky thing to do, right? You don't necessarily want to go so far with it where it becomes, niche and dead, like a heritage industry thing. Like there's only so many people who want to know about, niche items in European history, right? But at the same time, I think there's a danger if you universalize it too much, it ceases to have a kind of grounding in, not reality is not the right word for it, but in history. I wouldn't necessarily ground it so much in the abstract ideals. I think we can teach there's a good point. So we can teach the abstract ideals that come from the Renaissance, right? Individual autonomy, the ability of man to transcend their circumstances through thought, through the humanities, to build a vocabulary and build a framework of thinking that enables them to function and enables them to be adaptable in the world. That's a beautiful legacy of the Western humanities, right? There's elements of that in other traditions, but I firmly believe the European one, this is going to get me in trouble with some people, but the European one is the most amenable to being picked up and pulled around and put in different places, right? You can see this with the vast interest in Western civilization that some of my Chinese students have, and my Japanese students. They're fascinated. When I go to Japan, and when I look for things like the Francis in the Garden, I see statues of David from Michelangelo's David. I see Roman columns integrated into Japanese anime. I mean, there's a real deep appreciation for the Renaissance in other places. We still have it here, but we have to kind of fight for it.
It's worth pointing out that the Renaissance itself was a kind of appropriation of classical visual arts, architecture, other things too.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, they had to wrestle with the classics. And there's a reason why the humanists absolutely adored the fathers, right? The church fathers, just because people like Jerome, who were, deeply educated in the classics, classical rhetoric, classical philosophy, but they were at the end of the day, they were Christians rather than Ciceronians, to quote the dream of Jerome, right? But getting back to your original question,
it's a hard question. You don't have to have a complete answer right now.
No, it's true. It's true. It's a great question because think about the reverse of this. It would be, I think, a shame to kind of to co-opt other people's history to the degree that it no longer is attributable to them and their culture and their people, right? It's difficult. There's a kind of double standard there. And there's you can go way too far in it. And then we're kind of battling this in medieval studies and Renaissance studies and early modern studies, this idea that those histories are for people of European descent, right? We have to fight back on that because there's no future.
I read a Facebook post over a decade ago now that made me so sad. It said, "The Civil War is a story for white people." And nothing makes me sadder than that thought. But I take your point that you could universalize things too much. You could drain them of their historical specificity. And that is something that happens maybe especially when Hollywood or various parts of, advertising especially pick up things from other cultures. They frequently become kind of deracinated, and it's sad.
It's sad. I think there's a kind of, at the heart of it, there's a kind of commentary on people's perception of power when it comes to that. The culture that's considered to be most dominant, which is Western civilization, Western culture, and has been for 2-3 centuries now. There's a kind of idea that you can punch up on that by kind of appropriating parts of it or writing yourself into it. But at the same time, it's not the same thing for, say, an Irishman to do that, right? It's one thing to do it to an English story, right?
Yeah.
It's a different thing to do it to an Irish story or a Scottish story, right? Yeah.
Can I give another example here?
Of course.
Something that I don't know if we've talked about it or not, but something that I see as incredibly positive or at least interesting in the culture is this uncommented upon insertion, or let's just say use, of Black actors in period pieces from before the 20th century. And I don't remember if we've talked about this or not, but I've talked to people who have different opinions on it. I personally love it. There was that show Bridgerton that has a kind of Jane Austen Regency feel to it. I've never watched the show, I should admit, but it has Black actors simply playing English dukes and duchesses. Like I said, I've not watched the show, so I shouldn't say too many things about a show I haven't watched. But this is something that happens now, and I would just point out that it's something that's happened in theater for a very long time.
Sure, absolutely.
And we're all pretty much used to it there. I mean, seeing casts of Romeo and Juliet that are mixed race is something that I've just grown completely used to, and I sort of like it from the perspective of maybe the kind of thing that you're criticizing, which is to say that it points to the universal in these stories. Sure. But I can see other perspectives on it. So what would be your thought about something like that?
I think that there's room for both, to be honest with you. I think that there's room for both. I think that if you want to teach the abstracted universal values that have come from Western civilization and the great works like Shakespeare, you can definitely do that. People need to be able to see themselves in those stories. But I think that there's also the inverse of that. If it's a kind of documentary, like let's bring up the Cleopatra example. This is a great example. So recently, if your listeners don't know, there was a documentary about Cleopatra, and she was cast as an African American woman, or as a sub-Saharan African woman, right? And the Egyptian government exploded. The Egyptian government said, "This is our history. She was a woman of Greek descent, right? You're co-opting, our history." Well, what is Egyptian history? What's our history? And they tied it to a kind of pan-African political movement, right? Which often tries to see sub-Saharan African figures in North African history, in global history, right? So, but the difference between, say, Bridgerton and that is that was a documentary. We know who Cleopatra's ancestors are. They're the Ptolemaic dynasty. They're Greek, right?
Yeah.
There's something similar with a Roman emperor named Septimus Severus, who was born in North Africa. often people like to point out that he was an African emperor. But what do you mean by that? Well, we know who his parents were. They were Italians. They were Italians. Recently, the BBC made a documentary about kind of African contributions to English history, and they pointed out Septimus Severus. But exactly, there's a still constant battle right there. I mean, that is an instance in which people kind of are using an ethnic point of view to try to write themselves, or try to not write themselves, but try to see themselves in a universal light. Look at what my people have done for this great institution, which they are definitely now legitimately a part of, right?
Right.
But yeah, so I think that there's room to answer your question. It depends on if it's a work of art or literature that has a kind of it starts from a pretense of fiction. I have no problem with it. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Thank you. This is an extraordinarily thorny topic in a way, because it gets into issues of cultural appropriation, representation. Sure. These are things that are very important to some people. Mm-hmm. And I hope anybody who's listening, if they've made it this far, hears in the two of us that we are trying to grapple with what we think are legitimately complicated issues. We are not censuring anybody or decrying woke Hollywood or something like this. We're just trying to understand the ins and outs of this difficult issue, which I genuinely think that nobody really completely can wrap their mind around at this point. I would also add that anyone who thinks that we're going to be able to, from some elite point of view, tell normal people how to recall their history, that's simply false.
Absolutely. And the freedom to have both is a product of Western civilization, right? I think the freedom to have a Bridgerton and also to have I want to bring up a film that I think is a good counterexample. Yeah. And it's called The Witch. Yes. It's by a man named Robert Eggers. He was a great director, great new director, fairly young guy. And what Eggers
it was his first film, I believe, which is incredible because it's a masterpiece.
It's a masterpiece. And it takes the complete opposite tack of a Bridgerton. And what Robert Eggers does is he says, I want you to feel, I want you to sense, I want you to hear 17th century New England. I want to bring you to a foreign country, to use a cliche. And I want you to be kind of put off by the otherness of it, but I want you to be fascinated by the otherness of it. There's a value, I think, in his films because he recognizes how attractive the other is for us. Because we live Bridgerton, right? We live Bridgerton. We don't necessarily need to escape into a fantasy of Bridgerton. If you want to escape into something that challenges you, wrestling with the otherness of the past is one of the best ways to do it. I mean, Eggers has his actors speak with the rhotic R. Yeah, I mean, he even brings in double predestination. I mean, he brings up Calvinism, right? It's woven into the film. It's never like wink, wink, here's Calvinism. It's subtly placed into the text, right? They bring in a lot of demonological literature that was obviously extremely prevalent in the 17th century and among the Puritans. But my point with this is that it's so visually and so linguistically arresting because it really wants to show you the otherness of it. I mean, and that's deeply a part of American history. I think I deeply admire the American Revolution, but I would push back on the idea that that's such a foundational kind of break moment. I think there's a lot of English still in there in the 18th century. I think there's a lot of 17th century in the 18th century. I mean, you know as well as I do, like how much the revolutionaries admired continental thinkers and English thinkers, right? So that's deeply a part of us. And
this is to hit my own hobby horse a little bit. They sort of thought of themselves as doing the English Civil War Part 2.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't remember the name of the historian, but there was a historian of the later 20th century who argued that there was a lot of the Tudor Constitution in the American Revolution, almost as much as the kind of Enlightenment ideas, because the Tudor government was a bit more devolved than we think. It was a lot of it was based on kind of local representation.
The monarchical republic, it's sometimes called.
Yeah, absolutely. But to take us back, I mean, we're really talking about how we transfer memories of the past. And I think if people, thinking, intelligent, sensitive people will be able to spot the difference and enjoy both a Bridgerton and a witch and the witch, the past taken on its own terms, I think it has an endurance to it that we don't quite appreciate. At least in a lot of contemporary culture, right? Pop culture. There's a kind of drive to domesticate things. And there always has been. It's not a new phenomenon. A lot of people make that mistake of thinking that, to bring it to your point, we're not criticizing kind of wokery, right? The desire to reshape classic works is a facet of Western Civ, right?
Absolutely. We were just talking about the Bible and dressing up Esther as a early modern burger.
Exactly.
Burger's daughter.
So that kind of it's partially a facet of kind of Western self-fashioning. Also, Western self-critique is in there. Like that's part of our tradition too. So it's not a stark dichotomy as you've just articulated, Clay. These are real questions that can be articulated in a lot of different ways. They have an enduring purchase. I think there's room for both, as I said.
As we begin to wind things down to a close, I wondered if you could tell a personal story. That is the story of the statue of Sir Francis Drake in Marin County. I was very surprised to find out there was a statue of Sir Francis Drake in Marin County, but I was even more interested and surprised to find out what your involvement was in its story. So could you tell us that story?
Definitely. So the background of the story is I was at the University of Heidelberg doing research, and I was reading a news article about a campaign to pull down a statue of Sir Francis Drake in Marin County. And that was the first time, like you said, that I had heard that there was a statue of Sir Francis Drake in Marin County. I remember, obviously, that Francis circumnavigated the earth, and I had heard that he landed on the coast as well. And sure enough, Marin County is the place where most local historians believe that he landed. And so I believe it was in the 80s or 90s that there was a statue made of him. And it's a bit like, it's not specifically Francis Drake, but it's a statue of an explorer. But nearby, there's a Sir Francis Drake Boulevard. And very recently, there was a campaign that came to light where people had read more further about Francis's kind of pre-exploratory, pre-military career as a young sailor. And he had served on a slave ship that was owned by his cousin. I think his cousin was named John Hawkins, I believe. But Francis was not the leader of those expeditions. He was simply a young sailor. But this campaign was to try to get rid of the monuments to Sir Francis Drake based upon what he had done as a young man, which was to be a part of this slaving enterprise. But it raises that question of how much of the baby do we throw out with the bathwater? So I wrote to the town council, I wrote to the mayor, a woman named Julie Ross, and I proceeded to kind of talk to them and kind of advise them on what the attitudes would have been for Francis revolving around race, early modern attitudes towards race, early modern attitudes towards indigeneity, right? And I was able to kind of not convince them, but I was able to articulate how different the Elizabethans of Sir Francis Drake's time would have approached these issues versus the overt white supremacy that we see in the 18th and the 19th centuries, the kind of pseudo-scientific hierarchy of race that Europeans develop actually after the age of exploration in a lot of ways, in the way it's articulated to us. So I was able to get them to see how nuanced Francis would have been when he landed there. I mean, he actually had friendly relations with the local Miwok people. He traded with them. He met their tribal leader. And, it was very much a meeting of an Elizabethan, right? I mean, the questions of rank are often more what Elizabethans approach explanations. We know this with, with our own knowledge of Shakespeare, right? Rank is always usually paramount. So I was able to articulate to them in a letter I wrote to the town council all of these things about what the value of this nuance in that. Mm-hmm. And even if you took issue, which you should, with some of the things that Francis did as a young man, that doesn't necessarily negate the value of seeing the legacy of a man who helped patch the world together. Mm. Right? If you value internationalism, if you value a global culture, if you value seeing your locality in the story of the world, who better than Sir Francis Drake, right? As a local figure of commemoration to see that. So my argument was, you don't have to agree with everything he did to see the value in his legacy. And my letter was read to the town council during the deliberations. It was published in the local paper, and I got several letters of feedback from it, both good and some pushback on it, which I answered. And we ultimately won. So we kind of pushed back on cancel culture. The town council decided to keep the commemoration of the boulevard, Sir Francis Drake. The statue, which was not specifically Sir Francis Drake, was removed, but the town council kept other commemorations, including one of the main boulevards in town. So that directly bore his name. So that was a victory. I think, for nuance, for historicism, for a conversation, rather than a jump to what I think is a kind of ahistorical moralism that really doesn't serve all that many people. It's quite narrow, in my opinion. If you want to talk about the universal story that can come from Western Civ, we need to know about people. We need to have people like Sir Francis Drake in our memory scape, right? If you remove them, one of the arguments is, for example, well, get rid of these statues because they'll still be in a book. I can still read about these people in a book, right? I think that's kind of a specious argument. Of course, they're going to be in a book. They're important. They did important things. But are people going to know to even look in the book if they don't see that statue, if they don't see that name, if they don't inquire, why is this person worthy of commemoration? Or some people often make the argument that the statues honor them, right? That may be true in some instances, but it's also a lesson. It's also a way to bring people into that deeper, more nuanced understanding when you deal with a figure with a conflicted history. So I don't think it's necessarily always an honoring thing to have a statue. It's important to remember in and of itself, right?
That's a great point. And I think remembering that statues and even courses in great books can be opportunities to enter into a dialogue that includes disagreement. Hopefully it includes passionate and engaged disagreement, but disagreement nevertheless. I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. Well, Colin, you've been a great guest, and you've really provided a lot of great information, and your perspective is incredibly valuable. And I'm so grateful that you spared the time here to talk to me on this podcast. And I know my listeners will benefit.
I deeply appreciate it, Clay. And thank you for putting this together. I think it's a great opportunity to people to articulate something that needs articulating. I mean, the defense of teaching Western civilization, the utility of Western civilization, I think, as we talked about in our conversation, it can't remain a kind of niche, racialized or ethnicized or nationalized thing if it isn't to have a future in a globalized world. I mean, we talked about the kind of dangers of taking that too far and stripping people of their culture and their heritage, which is a problem, right? We can't treat Ireland the same way as England, right? So there's a lot of nuance that can be afforded there. But I think that if people simply look around and take the time to look around, they'll see it in the memory scape. They'll see value and utility of Western civilization in the memory scape, and they'll be able to see the endurance of that in the symbols and signs, even if they fight against them, fighting against them can also raise awareness, honestly, of them. And we can have that debate and that conversation. Things taken for granted and not reassessed fall down into oblivion often. So the debate about Francis Drake, I'm sure some people hadn't looked at that sign in years, right? But reading my article in the paper, hearing about the debate, hearing from Mayor Ross, a lot of people now know about why Francis Drake is important. And that's what I would say. That's what I would say to that question.
Well, thanks, Colin. Come back on, okay?
I will. When I have some more fruits to bring you, I certainly will.
Sounds great. Many thanks.